approval of minutes yet. We need one other commission member to make a quorum. So we're going to start with the executive director's report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon, Jeff.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Our activity for the past month since we've last met, we had 6 tobacco violations for which 6 people were charged, and that resulted in the seizure of almost 24,000 sticks of other tobacco products, or OTP, and 83 packs of contraband cigarettes. We also had 1 alcohol violation of the first in the same period, which led to 6 containers of distilled spirits being seized. On our reports, kind of like, I hate to say it this way, it's kind of like what I mentioned last month. We're done. We're done with everything we need to finish. It is under final review in our Revenue Administration Division for this annual alcohol and tobacco tax report, which is a combined report. I've mentioned before, it's actually it's a very lengthy, very detailed report. So it is currently with the Revenue Administration Division for their final review. We've done all of our final edits, and once that's done, it'll be, I expect that's a matter of days now. And I'll make sure that you guys each get an electronic copy once it's been completed. And I want to let you know about something we do. Part of what we're supposed to do is provide training, and we've taken it upon ourselves to provide training, not just to our licensing boards and health departments where we can, and the inspectors who are conducting various inspections, tobacco or alcohol inspections, but also anybody who might be interested, and the industry in general. And we do that in part by putting out these advisories, and we try to put out at least a dozen of them a year if we can. We're pretty much 1 a month. Every now and again, it might be 2. And I just want to let you know about 2 that we've done since our last reporting period. I'm going to try and include that within the meeting as well now, so that you'll have a sense of what we've done. We put out the 5th one we put out for the year was really a recap of a couple of pieces of legislation that were fairly significant. They were legislation that expanded or continued the expansion of privileges that the governor enacted through his executive orders. General Assembly considered those because they came to an end on August 15th. The General Assembly had considered those, though, in the spring last session, and doing that, passed legislation to extend them for a period of time. They both sunset. Expanded privileges for retailers last until January 30th, 2023, and the expanded privileges for manufacturers sunsets December 31st, 2022. And the idea is to continue to give them some very favorable additional abilities to continue trying to rebuild their business or to even grow a little bit during what's still a little remnant of difficult times. So I put those out as well. And the second we put out was number 6. And what that did is something very beneficial. It was really directed toward our brewers, the Maryland breweries. Something very beneficial for them. It's a logistical, technical thing, but it's going to make them very happy. And that is, previous to this, they had to file every month tax forms and information reports to the comptroller. And a couple of years ago, the comptroller was given the authority, actually that may have been even last year, the comptroller was given the authority to allow brewers, previously distillers and wineries could do this, brewers could not, create regulation to allow them to report on a varied reporting scale, depending on the comptroller's determination of how often they should do it. If they're huge mega businesses, they should probably continue to report and remit taxes every month. But our brewers are they're small businesses, every one of them in the state. So the comptrollers decided to allow all of them by regulation, all of them are allowed to remit their taxes and reporting requirements quarterly, which is great news for them. They only have to do it 4 times a year instead of 12. And one of the other things we put in this advisory is, 1, instructing them that that's the case now, effective with this quarter we're in. And the second part is re-emphasizing they are required by statute to submit certain information that we need for part of our reports every year. It's not a may submit the information, it's a will submit the information. It's one that's mandated by the General Assembly, and it's something that we include in our annual report. So we kind of put a little bit of strong language in there that says you must do this. If you don't, manufacturers, you may subject yourselves to hearing, which can lead up to revocation of your licenses. So it's a real serious issue that we get them in. Overwhelmingly, we get compliance, but there are a few who consistently don't comply. And it's time that they've got to step up and get these things done, or else we're just going to get them mixed up. So that's that part. Since our last meeting, and I'll speak briefly, if I may, for the chair and myself, we both attended a Senate Finance Committee meeting since our last meeting, which was to discuss cannabis. The Maryland Cannabis Commission put on a presentation, as well as the chair and I did, and it was pretty interesting program there. We really talked. Well, the Cannabis Commission talked a lot about, obviously, the world of cannabis, our comments were really about regulation and our strengths in regulation and how there are some important considerations when regulating cannabis that may translate from what we do already with tobacco and alcohol regulation. And then last week, I was invited to attend one other additional meeting similar to this. It was with the House. And it was essentially to do the same thing. This was a different type of a committee. It wasn't a standing committee, but it was the House Cannabis Work Group Committee that I was asked to speak on. And it was significantly different than what our discussion and meeting was with the Senate. What was really fascinating to me, and I'm saying this as a way to introduce Matt Swinburne, what was really interesting was the emphasis on social equity. So I got the sense now that the General Assembly is looking to do two things. They want a well-structured, well-regulated, properly taxed, enforced, legitimate adult use cannabis operation, and equally, they want a ready-to-run social equity component of this so that people will have an even opportunity in this industry, this brand new industry potentially, from the beginning, so that everybody's kind of starting off at the same place or can very quickly catch up. And I thought Matt's presentation was just outstanding, which is part why he's here today, and I'm glad he is. I'm really looking forward to that. I think you're gonna learn a lot. So that is that for me, Mr. Chair. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any, and otherwise, I'm ready to move on.
Okay. Mr. Poole was on briefly. Are you still with us, Robert?
I am, sir. I apologize for the telecommunications issues. Thank you.
That's not a problem. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open the meeting. I see that we have Barbara Wall with us, and we have Robert Poole and myself, Al Silverstein. So we do have a quorum. I ask for approval of the October 21st meeting minutes.
I move to approve.
Okay, Barbara. And Eric Poole seconds the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Okay, thank you. Our next item is the Maryland Department of Health, and Nicardi, apologize if I mispronounce your name, is going to speak to us about, she's from the Center for Tobacco Prevention and Control. We're going to talk about youth pandemic behavior survey and alcohol data. Are you with us?
I am. I'm unable to present my screen. Oh, okay. Now I have access. Great.
Wonderful.
Okay. And thank you again for having me. My name is Nicardi Jala. I'm the epidemiologist for the Center for Tobacco Prevention and Control. Last week, I believe Blair Ennis talked about some of the tobacco data that we did on the Youth Pandemic Behavior Survey. So this time I'm going to be talking about the alcohol data that we collected. Okay. All right.
There, we got your screen.
Okay, great. So you're seeing the screen, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great.
And we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, sure. Okay. Well, so the Youth Pandemic Behavior Survey was an online survey that we did this summer, May to June, where we surveyed 608 students from high school age 14 to 19. We worked with a contractor who recruited the students through social media ads. So you can see some of the social media ads here on the screen. And we really wanted to kind of see what was happening with students, since due to the COVID-19 pandemic, our regular biannual Youth Risk Behavior Survey, Youth Tobacco Survey was not conducted because we were unable to get into schools. Okay, so here you can just see some of the ads that were posted on Instagram and Facebook. And we did end up getting 608.
We're still on the ads. I'm sorry. It jumped back.
Yeah, we were able to get 608 students, and these are the results. So For alcohol data, we asked a question that said, how would you describe your alcohol use during the COVID-19 pandemic compared to before the pandemic started? So this question was part of our COVID-19 specific questions. So we had about 14 questions that really dug into what was happening during the pandemic. So here you can see that about 36% said that they drank less alcohol, which is really great. 25% drank the same amount of alcohol, and about 29.5% drank more alcohol. And so we can kind of see that distribution here. But we did like that. We saw 36% actually drank less, which was higher than the ones that drank more. Now looking at past 30-day alcohol use, about 1 in 5 students, so about 20% of students reported having at least 1 drink of alcohol during the past 30 days. So the question asked students to report how many days approximately they drank alcohol in the last 30 days that have passed. And so here you can kind of see the breakdown here. So a majority, 39.7% of students reported 1 to 2 days out of the month drinking alcohol. 30.6% reported 3 to 5 days. 17.8% reported 6 to 9 days. And then about 12% of students reported drinking alcohol 10 or more days during the last 30 days. And we also had a binge drinking question, which asked students to report if they've engaged in binge drinking. So that's 4 drinks for females and 5 drinks for males. And here we see that about 12.6%, almost 13% of students engaged in binge drinking in the past 30 days. Now looking at alcohol and vehicle safety. So we also have a lot of questions regarding just safety and drinking alcohol. So here we see 2 questions that were asked, or 2 data points, I would say. One is specific to students who rode with someone who had been drinking alcohol, and one is of students who actually drove a car or other vehicle when they had drank alcohol. So here we see that 15% of students reported actually riding with a driver who had been drinking, and then 14% of students actually drove a car or other vehicle when they had been drinking alcohol. So that is concerning. Okay, so we have recently released our new infographic on the Youth Pandemic Behavior Survey. So as you can see here, there's a lot of topics that were covered in the survey. So we had a lot of topics on mental health. We had topics regarding adverse childhood experiences, alcohol, tobacco use, drug use, emotional support questions. And so if anyone's interested in seeing this infographic, please send me an email and I can send it over to you. Our contractor is also working on 2 additional infographics that will focus on, one would be adverse childhood experiences and positive childhood experiences. And then the other will be focused on substance use in general for this survey. So that's all I have. This is my contact information. If you're interested in the data, please send me an email and I can get that to you.
Nicardi, thank you very much for the presentation.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Our next presentation is going to be on social equity and adult use cannabis industry. Matt, are you ready?
I think I am ready. I'm going to try to get the tech right. So you'll give me just a second. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my PowerPoint. My name is Matthew Swinburne. I'm the Associate Director at the Network for Public Health Law. We are a legal nonprofit that provides legal technical assistance to folks around the country in a broad spectrum of public health issues, ranging from emergency powers to traumatic brain injury to food insecurity to cannabis regulation. And that's what I'm here to talk about today, is the legal policies that states have adopted to kind of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion within state-run cannabis industries or state-regulated cannabis industries. But I just wanted to thank Director Kelly and the Commission for having me here today before I go any further. Now, my presentation is going to be broken down into kind of two major parts. First, I'm going to look at the economic opportunities that exist within the cannabis industry and how those opportunities are distributed. And so, looking at elements of diversity within this industry to kind of set a baseline of why states are focusing on these sort of policies. And in the second part, I'll be talking about the actual policies themselves that states are adopting when regulating this space. Now, a lot of that discussion is going to focus on licensing because licensing is the door into this industry. And we'll look at the kind of equity measures in licensing that states have been adopting, but we'll also look at what type of business support is being provided to social equity applicants. We'll also look at how states are reinvesting the considerable tax revenue from this new industry back into communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about a few lessons learned, kind of newer policies that are being talked about in this space that I think will be adopted as states move forward. All right. So the cannabis industry is a very lucrative industry. Now, I've got some data here from an industry study. And if you look back in 2019, the total sales in the legal cannabis industry, both the adult use and the medical side of things, totaled around $13 billion in sales. Now, fast forward to 2025, this study projects that the value of that industry will go up to about $43 billion in sales. Now, that increase is really being driven by two things. Number one, new states adopting adult use legalization or medical markets, and existing cannabis markets maturing with the idea that when they're first implemented, they're not reaching their full income potential. So that's why you see that considerable increase in the value of this industry. Now, the reason we're talking today is because communities of color are really missing out on the economic side of the cannabis boom. And I have some data from a 2017 study that looks at ownership in the cannabis industry. And this is it's a few years old, but there isn't a good, or more recent study that kind of looks at the state of play that I've been able to find. But this study pointed out that 81% of cannabis business owners were white. And it also pointed out that only 4.3% of business owners were African American. Now, these numbers have to be looked at through a couple different lenses. First, we need to look at, what portion of the US population is African American. Well, it's 12.8% according to the most recent census data. So you're already seeing a disparity there. But you also have to keep in mind that in this study, when they're asking for ownership interest, it didn't necessarily denote a controlling interest in these businesses. So if they were to look at a controlling interest, African Americans would have a much smaller percentage. Now, this is especially pertinent because if we look at how drug laws and cannabis laws in particular were enforced, they were done in an inequitable manner in that, they really targeted communities of color, Black communities in this country. And the ACLU's most recent study showed that still in the United States, if you are Black, you are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than your white counterpart, even though cannabis use or drug use across racial demographics is basically the same. Now, when we look at these disparities in ownership in the cannabis industry, it's not unique. This is an America problem. We do not have equitable representation in business ownership across the board. And the Census Bureau released information that showed that only 18.3% of all businesses were minority owned. So it kind of, the numbers are very similar to that of the cannabis industry. But, as was pointed out by Director Kelly, this is an industry that is being built right now. States in legalizing this have an opportunity to put the policies in place to try to balance the control of this industry so that it is more inclusive. Now, why am I talking so much about ownership of cannabis businesses? Well, it's because ownership in this industry can have kind of a cascading effect in terms of who will have access to the other economic opportunities in this space, like employment. Now, the cannabis industry employs a lot of people. There's data that shows in 2020, over 320,000 jobs were supported by the legal cannabis industry. But, there are plenty of studies that show ownership is incredibly important because of the racial biases and hiring practices that exist in this country. And so I've included the results of a couple studies, but the one I really want to focus people's attention to is the one at the bottom in red that indicates almost 58% of white-owned firms employed no minority employees, while 93.5% of Black firms had a workforce that was made up of at least 50% minority employees. And it just drives home the fact that minority ownership is critical to equitable access to employment opportunities within this industry, as in all industries in the United States. Now, when we look at, what are the barriers to minority participation in the cannabis industry, we first have to look at some basic facts about the United States, and that's the racial contours of poverty are critical here because, and I've got some of the poverty rate data here just to kind of point out the inequitable distribution of wealth in the United States, but to participate in the cannabis industry, you have to have money. There are high startup costs, and I have some data from a study that said, to open up a retail location or a dispensary, it's over $300,000 of initial startup costs. When you look at some of the other licenses, a processing business has approximately $500,000 of startup costs, and those are the businesses that manufacture the cannabis products from the plant. Another cost that's associated with this is some states require an applicant for a cannabis business license to have a certain amount of money on hand. So they have these capital requirements in place, essentially, showing that they have kind of the financial resources to compete in this very competitive market. And finally, another issue, in addition to the high costs and kind of the racial contours of poverty, marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. It is a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, And this impacts a lot of the federal banking laws. And as a result, the majority of banks don't want to provide services to cannabis businesses. Particularly, they don't want to provide loans. So, you don't have the same access to financial services right now because of the way federal law is. And as a result, 84% of businesses in the cannabis space use their founders' savings to launch that business. So it goes to the, kind of the financial barriers to minority participation. Now, when states start to look at policies to make the cannabis industry inclusive, one of the first things they need to do is determine the population they want to target with their policies. So who are they going to help with either, a licensing preference or special training program or low interest loans? And every state defines that target population a bit differently. And I'll refer to them as social equity applicants, just as a term to capture all these different categories of targeted populations. But there are a lot of variables that states use to kind of define the population they want to help. They'll often look at race, gender, or veteran status of the applicant. They'll also look at those same factors for the employees of a business. They'll often look at the income of the applicant, not in the same way as kind of a capital requirement, but providing some sort of preference for individuals with lower incomes is something that is a policy that's being adopted by states. And you will see states, providing, targeting individuals with prior cannabis offenses on their record. So rather than excluding these individuals from the legal market, giving them the opportunity and preferencing them in this process. They'll also look at kind of the location. They'll look at communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, and they'll target businesses owned by people from these communities, located in these communities, or businesses that employ individuals from these communities. And this disproportionate impact is usually measured by looking at high marijuana arrest rates, poverty rates, uninsured rates, and government benefit rates are all factors that states look at when they're trying to define the specific communities that have been disproportionately harmed. Now, states have to be careful when using some of these factors. And I'll give you, an example of kind of a very broad definition that captures a lot of kind of the variables we looked at in the previous slide. And this is looking at New Jersey. New Jersey just legalized adult use cannabis this year. And their policies focus on 3 categories of businesses: social equity businesses, diversity-owned businesses, and impact zone businesses. Now, the social equity businesses are owned by people who've lived in an economically disadvantaged area or have a prior cannabis offense. The diversity-owned businesses are minority, woman, or disabled veteran-owned businesses that have been certified as such by the state's Treasury Department. And impact zone businesses are located in impact zones, owned by people from impact zones, or employ people from impact zones. And an impact zone is defined in New Jersey state law based on high unemployment rate, crime index score, and the prevalence of marijuana arrests. So you have these 3 categories of businesses that will qualify for the diversity, equity, and inclusion policy that the state has adopted. But you'll notice they cover a broad spectrum of factors in their definition, because states need to be really careful on how they use race in licensing opportunities because, we can look to the state of Ohio for kind of a lesson learned. Now, when Ohio passed legislations for its medical cannabis program, they put in a racial quota. They indicated that 15% of the cultivator, processor, and testing laboratory licenses would be awarded to minority-owned businesses. And what happened was the state was sued for this racial quota. The lawsuit was brought by white applicants who did not get a license in this system, and they argued that they were denied equal protection under the law, and as a result, this provision was unconstitutional. And so the Ohio State Court, in reviewing this case, actually agreed with the white applicants, and it reviewed this provision under what's referred to as strict scrutiny, which is kind of the most intense review of a legal provision, and it's because it was race-based. And when you have kind of a race-based provision, that provision has to be narrowly tailored to the government's interest. And in this case, it was remedying racial discrimination, but the court said that, the state should have considered race-neutral options first, and that the state did not have the appropriate data to support this 15% quota that they had set aside. And as a result, the law was struck down. So this is kind of, an issue that states are cognizant of when they're crafting this, so that they're not just putting race-based quotas right in their licensing laws. Now, the next thing we'll look at is, once you qualify as a social equity applicant, what does that mean? Well, it varies from state to state. In some states, it means priority review of your application. So regardless of when you submit your application, it goes to the front of the line and is reviewed first. And so what this does is it potentially gives social equity applicants early access to the market, meaning they can get up and running faster if their applications are reviewed first. And this is a policy that's been adopted by several states. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey are examples of states that have used this tool to preference social equity applicants. Another policy approach that some states use is a license scoring preference. So, cannabis license applications are scored based on, their strength, the suitability for being awarded a license. And this is especially important when states limit the number of licenses they're going to award. And so, in some states, social equity applicants are awarded points just for being social equity applicants, which gives them, potentially a higher score in this competitive process. And I give the example of Illinois. They score their applications on a 250-point scale. And if an applicant qualifies as a social equity applicant, they're awarded 50 points for that status. So that's an example, and I've provided the definition that Illinois uses for determining social equity status, but it's, this license scoring preference is another tool that some states adopt. Another tool that's used in the licensing area is the creation of special license categories that are, essentially meant to give either an exclusive period to social equity applicants for this special type of license, or have what we think of as lower buy-in costs. And so I'll look at two examples here. In New Jersey, and they have what's referred to as micro business licenses. And this is a fairly common policy approach. But, as the name indicates, these are licenses for smaller businesses. So, in New Jersey, to be a micro business, you can have no more than 10 employees. You have to have a smaller facility, which they kind of set the benchmark at 250,000 square feet. and you have to deal with a smaller amount of cannabis in your business. Or if you're a grow, your grow operations can't have more than 1,000 plants, and you can't, deal in more than 1,000 pounds of usable cannabis in a month. And because it's these smaller businesses, the state has decided to reduce the application and licensing fees. So you're having an opportunity to participate in the market with a lower buy-in cost through these micro businesses. And, micro businesses are often subjected to less restrictions than the standard license applicant. And then sometimes they're given additional opportunities based on their micro business status. Now, I also want to look at Massachusetts, because this is a good example of a special license with an exclusivity period. So Massachusetts created the marijuana courier license. And what this license does is it allows the company to deliver cannabis products directly to the customer. Now, what Massachusetts did is they said for the first 36 months or 3 years, these licenses are only going to be available to social equity applicants. So there's this 3-year period where, only social equity applicants are going to have access to this opportunity. And if you look at this, this is, again, a licensing opportunity with a lower buy-in cost than, let's say, a cultivator or a processor license. Now, Connecticut has done something really interesting that ties into one of the next things I'm going to talk about in terms of training programs, but they created a special type of licensing opportunity with what are referred to as equity joint ventures and equity partnerships. And I will try to simplify this as much as I can, but what these policies are aimed at is getting existing licensees to support social equity applicants through financial support and kind of training and experience, sharing their experience with these social equity applicants. And so how does the state get the existing licensees to do this? Well, we've got to look at one baseline concept to understand how this program works. Now, when any state moves from just a medical system to an adult use system, they will create what are often referred to as dual licenses or hybrid licenses, meaning, the businesses that were licensed to participate in the medical market can also participate in the new adult use market. And these licensees don't have to go through the normal kind of lottery system application process. Often what they need to do is pay conversion fees or a large sum of money to gain that hybrid status. So in Connecticut, cannabis producers have to pay a $3 million conversion fee if they want to function both in the medical and the adult use space. And in addition to that $1 million conversion fee, there's a $500,000 fee that's paid to the state's Social Equity Council, which is the kind of administrative body that works on social equity issues in the cannabis industry. Now, dispensaries have a much lower conversion fee, but still it's $1 million to convert that license. Now, in order to get, to provide a financial incentive for existing licensees to work with social equity applicants, the state is offering, Connecticut's offering, to cut these conversion fees in half if the licensee agrees to an equity joint venture. And essentially what that means is that the existing licensee will go into business with a social equity applicant for 7 years. So they're going to have the financial support of that hybrid or existing licensee, and they'll also benefit from their experience in running this new equity joint venture. Now, producers, if they want that discounted fee, have to support 2 joint ventures, and if dispensaries want to cut that $1 million conversion fee in half, they have to enter into 1 joint venture. So that's one of the financial incentives that Connecticut has put forward. The other is this equity partnership concept, and this is only for the growers or producers. So remember, there was this $500,000 fee that they needed to pay to the Social Equity Council. Well, that fee will be waived if the grower agrees to provide a social equity applicant with 5% of their grow space, and they agree to mentor that social equity applicant, cover their overhead costs, help ensure that they're complying with the state's regulations, and they give all the profits from that 5% of the grow space to the social equity applicant. And they have to do this for 5 years. So it's another attempt to get the existing participants in the market to share their experience and to provide financial support in these 2 specific licensing opportunities. So that's, I think, something new and interesting that's on kind of the radar now that Connecticut has done this. Now, we talked a lot about licensing, but states have other policies to try to support social equity applicants. And as we talked about, there's a lack of banking services because of the challenges at the federal level. And as a result, some states are offering low interest loans or even grants to help social equity applicants enter into the industry or to successfully operate in that marketplace. And, Illinois is an example of a state that's done that with their Cannabis Development Fund. Another kind of bit of financial support that states will do is that they'll waive application fees or reduce, licensing fees for social equity applicants to help reduce that barrier to participation. And, states will provide special education and training programs that look at, educating social equity applicants on issues of legal compliance, best practices, how to identify and raise funds, a broad spectrum of issues. And, for example, New York has created kind of a social equity incubator to provide these type of services for social equity businesses within their cannabis industry. Now, the next thing we'll talk about, and we're getting close to the end, is, kind of tangentially related to this is, the adult use industry is going to be the source of considerable tax revenue for a state when they legalize the adult use industry. And, what the state chooses to do with those funds varies. States make different decisions. And, a lot of times, though, states will reinvest some of that tax revenue back into the communities that were most harmed by the war on drugs. And I'm going to highlight New York's approach because they really put essentially all of the tax revenue back into the community in different ways once they covered the cost of administering their cannabis program. So 40% of their funds from their cannabis revenue fund are going to go back to the schools through the state's lottery fund that provides grants to eligible school districts. 20% of the funding is going to go for drug treatment and public education through grants from the Office of Addiction Services. And 40% of that revenue is going to go into a special fund called the Community Grants Reinvestment Fund. And what that does is provide grants to community-based nonprofits and local governments to reinvest in communities, whether through job training programs, nutrition programs, different education programs. There are a lot of different programs that these grants can support. And finally, kind of some of the trends or ideas that are, being talked about and are kind of newer ideas. And I'll kind of take these out of order. First, we'll look at the simplest of kind of trends is states are creating concrete goals for their social equity programs. It's not just the general goal of increasing representation. States are saying that, they're going to set aside a certain percentage of licenses for social equity applicants. New York has allocated 50% of their new licenses for social equity applicants, and the same with Connecticut. So, it's this idea if you need to have definitive metrics to kind of measure the success of your efforts. The other kind of trend that we're seeing is that states are starting to realize that running social equity programs for the cannabis industry is a lot of work. So they are, and requires specialized knowledge. So states are starting to create what I'm going to refer to as social equity leads. So either positions within their regulatory agency or kind of a board or a regulatory body that is dedicated to issues of social equity within the cannabis space. And I've given two examples here again. I'm using New York and Connecticut because they're two of the newer states to legalize and are adopting some of these new approaches that they've learned from their experience with their medical programs and other states' experiences with the adult space. Now, another thing that I've heard discussed is the application process. And if you really want to be inclusive, you need to streamline your licensing process, because the more complex the licensing process, the more it favors what is referred to as multi-state operators, kind of the big businesses within the cannabis space. The businesses that have the resources to hire the consultants to, fill out the different aspects of the application. So, streamlining the processes so that they cover what's necessary, but don't require a huge initial financial investment to complete for these smaller businesses or these equity businesses. And the last thing I'm going to point out is that, I mentioned that states, have these dual license or hybrid license systems that allow the medical cannabis businesses to operate in the adult use industry. And I don't think that policy alone is problematic, because these are businesses with experience in this space, and it's a way to, have experienced operators in there from the start. But what has happened in Illinois shows that when you grant licensees access to the adult use market is critical. So what happened with the dual licenses in Illinois is that they paid a rather large fee to get their dual license status, and they were granted access to the adult use market. So they're operating in that industry, selling their product within the adult use market in Illinois. But the social equity applicants, there were problems, with COVID and the lotteries for the social equity licenses. And as a result, they didn't get access to the adult use market at the same time. There's this huge kind of head start that kind of the existing dual license businesses received by getting earlier access to the cannabis marketplace in Illinois. So it's just something that's a little detail, but got a lot of attention because it really did handicap the social equity applicants within the adult use market there in Illinois. So that is my presentation. Thank you for your time. I've provided my contact information here, and I can provide a copy of my slides for folks. Yeah,
We'd
if I could just figure out how to close out.
Matt, we appreciate that, and please make sure Jeff gets a copy of your slides. And then those folks can contact Jeff and go accordingly. Please, we need to note in the minutes that Eric Morset has joined us. Good to have you on today. Does anybody have any questions for Matt?
Mr. Chair, if I could just. Go ahead, Commissioner, you go first.
So I just had one question. Well, I guess two questions. I'm curious about the efficacy going, like of these programs of existing states. How were their outcomes? Like I'm curious to know, like, if of those states that were trying these social programs, if they bore fruit. I'm also curious about the net revenue from some of these states on the other end of it. Like, how much were they actually able to generate for their respective states? And like, did they have the kind of, did they go towards the programs, and did they see kind of like, I'm mostly interested in like how the revenue kind of resulted in the outcomes, and like, did it bear itself out in the kind of longer sweep of things?
So I think there's a lot to unpack with that question. So first, in terms of, the success of the different programs, I think there's a couple challenges that not every state is publicly providing information on kind of the success of their social equity programs. I think if you look at, Maryland, with the second round of licensing, Maryland was very successful in getting, and I know there were challenges in the first round that have been covered, but they were successful, in increasing diversity with the policies they had in place for their medical market. I think, one of the things, and this is actually something I'm investigating for the House's legislative work group on legalization, is some of the original cannabis states did not include social equity measures when they were creating their programs. So if you're looking, kind of the West Coast players didn't have the strong equity programs from the start. And these are the folks who have kind of the longest kind of run of data. So you're seeing states like Illinois, which, I think was 2018 with their legislation. So these more developed, equity programs are newer. And so, looking for, data there, it's in a newer program, is something that could be a challenge. But I think Massachusetts and Illinois within the adult use space have had some success. I can't tell you what the percentages are for the, equity applicants in terms of the licenses they've provided. But I think because, states are learning as they go, I highlighted having specific equity goals so that, New York is going to be successful because they're mandating that 50% of those licenses go to social equity applicants. Connecticut, these states that set these goals, there's going to be an easy way to evaluate whether or not the kind of kitchen sink approach of policies is effective. Because I think another challenge is because there's so many different policies kind of being used to try to tackle this disparity is, which of these is having kind of the beneficial impact that you want. So I haven't seen kind of that type of analysis in terms of, well, this type of policy is having, this type of impact in terms of improving, representation in this industry. But yeah, I think we'll learn more about the effectiveness of policies as kind of we continue to move forward. So, I had a legislator ask me to give them a state that was successful that they could reverse engineer an equity program from, and they're probably going to be looking at some of these newer states that have had a couple years to kind of put these newer measures in place. You know, there's not going to be data from New York or New Jersey or Connecticut because they're not even at the licensing stage, but they have these very kind of what I refer to as kind of advanced social equity programs. So it's going to be looking at states like Massachusetts and Illinois, which have been kind of pushing, you know, in the equity space and looking at, you know, this kind of diverse array of policies, you know, early on in their market, because the challenge is, and I think states are seeing this, you know, since there's kind of natural progression from a medical states, you know, start out with a medical program and then transition usually to allowing adult use as well. If you don't get the equity element right in the medical program, it's problematic for the adult space because of that kind of dual licensing hybrid approach. So yeah, it's something that I want to be able to study more. And I'm actually working on that, but don't have the great answer for you. But I think it's an interesting and important kind of information to understand, you know, what's the most effective approach to kind of reach concrete goals.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Mr. Kelly?
Thank you. Really, mine's more of a comment. I just like historical context as well. Probably the idea of having adult use cannabis or legal cannabis in Maryland's been around for now maybe the last 5 or 6 years. When it first came out, it was a bill that was just a few dozen pages long, and then it directed that the comptroller would regulate this commodity. And then over the years, the length of these bills have gotten longer and longer, but the one common denominator has always been the comptroller, and then transitioning to the ATC would be the regulator. I don't know if that's ultimately going to be the desire or wish of the General Assembly, but you know, looking at last year's bill, which was I think just under 100 pages long, it did indicate that the ATC would be playing a role in this. It would be joining forces with the Maryland Cannabis Commission to collectively be regulating this. And I think one of the things you really have to be alert to is the idea that you could be the body that is deliberating applications for social equity and making determinations. So that's, you know, when I saw Matt's presentation, I was just blown away by it. And there's just a lot of good information, which is why I thought maybe it'd be good for you to see it and start thinking in that mindset, because that could be what's coming at some point. And one of the things I've kind of gleaned from the last few weeks of the meetings we've been attending is that I get the sense that the Senate would like to pass a bill and that the House would like to have this go to referendum, and that a compromise could be something like that the Senate would structure a bill to lay all of this out, to lay what the regulatory framework would look like, the social equity framework would look like, and then make it contingent on a bill, a referendum going to the public for the next voting period, and then having the public vote on it. And then if the public votes in affirmative, then the Senate bill would already be passed and ready to go almost immediately. So there's really not even a lot of delay, is what I'm getting at. Is we almost have to move on this as if it's going to happen sooner than later, and because I think they're going to expect a fairly quick startup, and we think we've set some realistic expectations on how quickly things can be done. But I do think they're going to want to hit the ground running very quickly, and again concurrently with a strong regulatory structure and a strong social equity component. Matt, thanks again. I really appreciate you.
No, and I appreciate the opportunity to help out. And, you know, if issues arise in terms of questions about, you know, social equity in the cannabis industry or other issues, you know, I'm happy to help. You know, I'm developing a resource for Director Tilburg at the Medical Cannabis Commission that is kind of a comprehensive analysis of the different equity policy approaches that the 18 adult use states are using, and I leave DC out of that because, you know, last time I checked, they're not licensing businesses, and they have kind of a strange setup there. So, you know, that's something I could make available to you in the commission as kind of a tool to have in your back pocket, you know, to understand exactly who's doing what, you know, in the different approaches to specific policies.
that data as we start collecting it. You bet.
Matt, thank you very much. We look forward to working with you in the future. I know we're all going to need more information and to make qualified decisions. Okay, do we have any new business today that anybody wants to bring before us? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Just very quickly, I just want to make a notice here, more than anything, I guess, is I think we need to do a little reorganization within the ATC commission, and that would be really to create some kind of a legal legislative policy division. And I say that because I just have some ideas and thoughts that I want to bring before the commissioners in an executive session within the next couple of weeks. So I'll send out emails to see what your availability is, so perhaps we can have a very brief, well, as long as you'd like to take, session on some ideas that I have and what we might need to address the upcoming General Assembly session.
Sounds good. Commissioner Wall, do you have anything you want to add? Okay, Commissioner Marset. Commissioner Poole, anything? If not, I'd ask for a motion for adjournment. Don't everybody jump up. Have a motion, need a second, please.
Second.
Thank you. Motion is second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. I want to thank everybody else who's on the call. We appreciate your interest and look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.